Welcome to our Cities at Tufts virtual colloquium. I'm Professor Julian Adgerman, and together with my research assistants, Amelia Morton and Grant Perry, and our partners Shareable and the Bath Foundation, we organise Cities at Tufts as a cross-disciplinary academic initiative which recognises Tufts University as a leader in urban studies, urban planning and sustainability issues. We'd like to acknowledge that Tufts University's Medford campus is located on colonised Wampanoag and Massachusetts traditional territory. Today, we are delighted to host Jose Richard Aviles. Richard is a transportation analyst for the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. As part of the Community Power and Policy Partnership team, they support government agencies and partners with community organisations by providing trainings, technical assistance and evaluation support centering lived experience, vision and self-determination of the communities most impacted by transit inequities. Richard draws inspiration from their involvement with the Bus Riders Union in LA and participation in other social justice movements like marriage equality. Richard's talk today is provocatively named Reimagining Urban Planning. And in a break with tradition, Richard is going to speak rather than present slides and welcomes our participation. So please put any questions or points in the chat. Richard, a Zoom-tastic welcome to Cities at Tufts. Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. And just so you all know, and thank you for everyone who's joining us online. Just wanted to say before we started, this is also a fun reunion. I met Julian 6 years ago, have been a fan of Julian's work. And so it's now kind of exciting in a full circle moment to come back. I was still a student, I think, when I first met Julian, and now, well, now I'm just getting older. Again, thank you all so much for coming. Today, the talk is called Reimagining Urban Planning, and it's based on a webinar series that we've been hosting at the Othering and Belonging Institute as part of what's going to happen in the next couple of months. To give you some context, I am transitioning out of transportation equity work and now am the lead for arts and cultural strategy at the Institute. And we are doing and launching research around the concept of radical imagination for belonging. We are framing that work in the context of the design lab. So we're not interested so much in just producing resources, but rather is producing resources in addition to testing some of these ideas out. And the testing of the ideas is really thinking about activities and prompts and different ways that can exercise the muscle of imagination, particularly in a time where it feels like what we're getting most is hopelessness. There's an urgency not only in our cities, in our regions, in the country, in the world, for us to really rethink about how we're approaching the work that we're doing, particularly as urban planners. And so the Reimagining Urban Planning series was really born out of that. And we've been launching now. We've have 7 to 8 seminars. We are taking a break in November, given the elections, and we'll come back for our final seminar in December 12th, and I'd be more than happy to share that information so you all have it. And that seminar is called Planning for Dystopic Futures, though I've been sitting with changing the title of that seminar because the dystopic futures are here. And so the series basically intends to really and openly critique the way that we as urban planners have been trained, and propose a new way of thinking, a new way of approaching the work. The seminar has covered topics around belonging, arts and culture, our relationship to land, our relationship to economics, and then our last one is on dystopic futures. And again, just really thinking about what that relationship is. So what I'll do today is I'll go over through our first introductory dissent that we wrote. It was called State of the Practice, and it's supposed to ground the intention of the series. And then I'll begin to share some of the concepts and some of the reframes that have been born out of the speakers who have been a part of the series. And then I'll share with you some of the new imagination that we're having, or the things that we're imagining as the work is picking up. So I strongly believe that there are two types of planners. There are planners that romanticize the cities And then there are those planners who go into school to try to defend their hoods. And then while we get into the schools, I identify as one of the latter planners. I'm from South Central Los Angeles. I am based in Mexico City at the moment, but I am joining you all from Portland, Maine. So there's a lot of transient movement here. And while there is plenty of room within the field to advocate on behalf of communities, we as planners are not trained to be advocates on behalf of communities. Again, reimagining urban planning intends to interrogate the current way that we as planners are being trained, operate, and more importantly, the way that we perceive our relationship with the built environment. At the Institute, we've been working hard to think about belonging and to foster belonging as a global norm in the next 15 years. And so we hope that the series has been able to incite conversations that generate strategies and tactics that can foster belonging in an urban planning process. First, we talk about planning imagination. There's in the essay Towards a Planning Imagination, author Leonie Sandercock states that planning is a social project whose purpose is to manage the way in which people coexist in a way that celebrates and acknowledges the pluralities that are now true for cities in the 21st century. She argues that planning education has not prepared planners for this new form of coexistence, and this calls for a new planning imagination. Sandercock calls for a planning imagination that is political, audacious, creative, and therapeutic. We as planners have been taught that we are the observers of the built environment, a so-called neutrality, they say. Yet we as planners are participants in this ecology. We operate from a place where objectivity no longer works. Planning has always been political. Now we as planners have to ask ourselves, who are we committed to, and where do we stand in this political spectrum? We are trained as planners. When we are trained as planners, we are asked to seek a specialization, whether it is housing, transportation, land use, etc. Yet community members don't experience the built environment in silos. It's important to understand that so much of what we do as planners are all based on social constructions. The world we live in was someone's imagination. So we as planners have the ability to imagine. And like I asked before, who are we imagining for? It is important to also remember that planning is powerful, from the distribution of capital and resources to deciding over the use of land, something that inherently does not belong to us. I say all that to say that while planning is a field, planning also operates within systems of power. And if there's anything that Kimberly Crenshaw has taught us, is that power never works alone, and it never operates in the benefit of those that it oppresses. Lastly, in the essay, Planning as a Heterosexist Project, Dr. Frisch argues that planning is a social project that only seeks to promote heterosexuality whilst discriminating against queer identity. Now, Frisch makes it clear that planning doesn't explicitly discriminate against queerness, but rather planning as a project, the work of linking systemic structures and representation, rather than specifically writing policies that openly discriminate against queer folks. Urban planning as a heterosexist project focuses on the discourse of sexual difference as it formulates what is order versus disorder, public versus private, and family versus household. It's important to note that this social project is not limited just to heterosexism. It is true for white supremacy, capitalism, settler colonialism, patriarchy. Let it be known that there are entire wars happening in parts of the world in the name of settler colonialism. And what we're witnessing in the Middle East and in Gaza is an extreme violence of gentrification. Planning is informed by the discourse that surrounds each of these systems of powers and oppression. Power dynamics are not neutral. They must be challenged and transformed, and as planners, we have that capacity. That was the opening introductory descent for the state of the practice and how we started talking about reimagining urban planning this series. In our arts and culture webinar, we really focused on this notion that what arts and culture has done within the planning field has only been limited to institutional thinking. What do I mean by that? Usually what happens is that there's still nonprofits that are seeking for policy funding of who has access to art versus what art we're putting out there. But what we're forgetting is the power of culture. Culture teaches us what are the motivations, aspirations, fears, and joys of communities. One of the things that Julian and I bonded over was that I'm also trained as a social worker, and we talk a lot about cultural competency. And it's something that is missing in the planning field. We don't talk enough about cultural competency. And it's important to understand that there is so much room in how we're able to understand culture. In the Arts and Cultural Seminar, we talked about the importance of looking at arts and culture as a process to planning and not a product. In the same way that we talk about equity as a process and not a product. I became an urban planner because I love my hometown, Los Angeles. More importantly, I love the people who grew up in that city. I first became a planner before I knew that the field of urban planning existed. I organized with the Bus Riders Union at the age of 15 and was talking about the consent decree of 1996 and transit racism at the age of 17. And little did I know that that was a field called transportation planning. And well, now we're here. As a student bus rider, I had access to the entire city. Through each bus ride, I had the opportunity to witness a different shade of Los Angeles. I grew up along the line, the 105, which travels northwest across the city from Huntington Park to West Hollywood, two very different cities, racially, economically, ethnically, and linguistically. While in the beginning, I was very excited about the fact that I had both access to both quinceañeras and the queer clubs, quinceañeras being the place in Huntington Park, there's a street named Pacific Avenue that is known for being the place where everyone gets their tuxes and their dresses and all of the necessities for producing quinceañeras. And West Hollywood is our queer district in Los Angeles. I soon started realizing that the built environment also changed. While South Central was overwhelmingly full of check cashing places, hotels and motels, liquor stores, and fast food restaurants, West Hollywood was the complete opposite. It was a home to grocery stores, hospitals, Planned Parenthoods, coffee shops. Growing up, I was conditioned to believe that only white people deserved nice things. I share these stories just to highlight the importance of the built environment and its relationship to human development and identity formation. The places that we come from highly inform the people that we are, the way that we behave, our values, and our priorities. As planners, we have been trained to position the benefit of the state as the focus of our work, but where has that led us? We need to refocus our practice with a more critical lens. Again, I ask, whom are we planning for? And of course, before we can achieve a full paradigm shift within the field, which feels closer than we think, we must advocate for this new way of thinking, a new way of planning. This notion that we as planners must be neutral and objective no longer works. If we're being honest, this field was never neutral and objective. It has always benefited those with the most power and resources, and we need to politicize planning. A poor's people planning, if you will. Now, the question becomes, how do we become advocates? The advocate represents an individual, group, or organization. They affirm their position in language understandable to their client and to the decision makers they seek to convince. And again, like I mentioned before, I believe that there are two types of planners, planners that romanticize a city and planners that want to defend their hoods. I do believe that the field has shifted greatly over the several years. And as more planners like myself step into the field, planners with lived experience, we are planners that work at the intersection of technical expertise and lived experience. I joined the field because I don't only know gentrification, I myself and those around me have been displaced. One of the main differentiations between the two planners I just mentioned is positionality. While the first type of planner will speak about marginalized communities from a position of other, the second type of planner is part of the other. And again, while planning theory will tell us that we must operate as planners from a positionality of objectivity, we simply can't do that. The first step to truly being an advocate within urban planning is to have an understanding of social theories, critical race theory, gender theory, and other normative theoretical frameworks that inform our identity, power, and privilege, especially now. Having a sensibility to these different positionalities makes it clear that we as urban planners understand that space is political. So with that, I'll end some more of the formal talk and I'll let you know a little bit of what the series has been able to do. The series now has about 8,500 members in the network. I was sharing earlier that when we first planned the series, We were hoping we were going to have 20 people. And in our first seminar, we had over 1,200 folks join us from all over the world. We've had people join us from Nigeria, from Kenya, from India, from Vietnam. We've had people all over Europe. We've had people all over South and Latin America, and we've had people all over the US. And we did not know and still don't know what to do with this network. But if there's something that we've learned is that there is a hunger for a new way of thinking and a new discourse to be introduced in urban planning. When we talked about our on our seminar on land, we talked about this notion that now more than ever do we really need to understand that this relationship to land is not neutral, that it's also constructed. The idea of land ownership sits at the heart of the extraction-based global operating system. And because private property is a fundamental pillar of capitalism and othering, changing our relationship to land is essential to transitioning away from these systems and moving toward equity and belonging. Now, the work of shifting away from transactional systems that commodify land is both an everyday and a generational project. In the present day, people are already creating alternative legal forms of community ownership, rematriating and stewarding land, rethinking their individual responsibility as title holders, and building an ecosystem of practitioners centered around a broad vision of community stewardship that spans multiple sectors: private, public, and nonprofit movements, housing, labor, climate, justice, and racial justice, and geographic scales from local to global. These experiments must fit within the current legal frameworks for private property while also trying to transform them. As we think about some of the next steps for reimagining urban planning, and I'll begin to wrap up so we can have a conversation, one of the things that we have been doing, if folks know me, y'all know that I like to talk shit. And I am very informal about the way I do the work that I do. I mean, it's the way that my community taught me to do the work. And I do believe that the best planners are the señoras who sell the tamales, are the folks who are out on the streets, folks who are walking the streets. Like, that's where real planning happens for me. And I try to, relate. I mean, that's where I come from. And I try to be as close to that, even as planning has taken me to different places and different, opportunities. But I don't never forget where I come from. And that's why I'll always talk about South Central. And because of this informality and the way that I talk shit in the first couple of seminars, I talk shit about APA. I was like, we need to do something, like, who's listening? And this is even being a member of the APA Foresight Committee and thinking a lot about forecasting within the field. We then found out that the current president, Angela Brooks, who is now a really good friend, we just met up not too long ago, was attending all of our seminars and, yes, appreciated the APA shit talking. And now one of the things that we are imagining and working on is for the next national conference in May or April, in fact, check me on that, which will be happening in Denver. Reimagining Urban Planning will be a track within the conference. So not only will we be presenting some of the content and frameworks that have come out from the series, but we will be co-creating a couple of a new discourse to the field. Right now, the dream is to be in partnership with other organizations who are doing similar work to do a systemic analysis of planning curriculums across the US, identify the competencies in which planners are being trained in now, do a gaps analysis, and propose new competencies that are needed for urban planning in the world that we live in today, not only geopolitically, but also in the climate that we're living in, quite literally. And so one of the things that's coming out from those conversations, the one thing that we noticed, planners, we need to be trained in basics of human behavior. What do I mean by that? I'm, again, being a social worker, of course, my mind always goes there. We have a course that's called Human Behavior in the Social Environment. We're proposing something of a course called Human Behavior in the Built Environment. And usually what that means, it's how do you mitigate change and conflict? A lot of times community members may be in opposition to your projects, and it's not because of you, it's not because of your design. It might just be that there is some attachment that we need to work through. It might be that folks just don't know how to mitigate conflict and need more support doing conflict resolution. The point is, we need to know the basics of human behavior, because at the end of the day, we need to centralize people and not justify their existence in the built environment. We also talked a little bit about that the urban planner needs to become an archivist, thinking about the ways in which urban planning is currently being done. Y'all know that there is a thing called engagement burden. Communities are tired of being asked to fill out surveys, to participate in focus groups, in charrettes, when there's nothing that's being accomplished. And so one of the things that we've discussed as a framework, what would it look like if the urban planner operated from a sense of an archivist? Unpack all of those plans and all of those false promises that have been already talked to community and identify what is implementable in the current timeline, in the current scope. So we're not recreating the wheel. We talked about, the last thing I'll share is that we mentioned a little bit about what would it look like to reframe our relationship to time as urban planners. A 20-25-year master plan no longer works, particularly in a climate that is constantly changing, and we're feeling the impacts not only be greater, but they're coming more quickly. And so what would it look like if we planned for 5 years, for 7 years, for years under which administrations can actually accomplish something, and not in these 20, 35 years as the climate is rapidly changing? And the last thing I'll share is that some of the dreams that we have for the series right now, in the same way that we've talked about reimagining planning, we're thinking about reimagining the construction of the environment. So that is engaging engineers, that is engaging construction workers, construction managers, and engaging architects, because we know that that's when the community feels the most impact, when we begin to break ground. But the urban planner has no relationship in that moment of the work, and we should. The other series we're reimagining is a series on long bridging and doing bridging work between planners and engineers and architects, so that there's common ground for the way that we're centralizing equity and people in the work, again, from design to procurement to construction to evaluation. That's always been my big question of what is the role of the planner during construction? A lot of the times that means in the relationships that I've been able to build with community members, when you do engagement in a way that's more relationship built, community members will say things along the lines of like, girl, why are you starting to break ground at 7:30 in the morning? We have elders here. Can you start at 9? Who's managing that relationship, and who's telling the construction folks to go out at 9 versus 7:30, right? There's the little things that can still happen. And again, inequities are constantly happening throughout the entire process. And there is an opportunity and a way to also continue to think about equity as a product, as a process. Not my own Freudian slip. Oh my God, I'm like canceled in those 5 seconds. But equity as a process, in a process that is continuously happening, and there is an opportunity for we as planners to be stewards of land as opposed to facilitators of land transactions. With that being said, that is a little bit about reimagining urban planning. So I welcome questions and thoughts, particularly from you, Julia. I don't even know. I wonder what you must be thinking about this series. But yeah, that's pretty much the talk.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm just having a little bit of trouble getting back on screen. So while I'm doing that, I don't want to waste a moment. That was fantastic. I love the radicalness of this, Richard. And I was thinking, oh, excuse me. Am I
Voice
still
for the
here?
dog, though.
Yes. Yeah, much more handsome than me. One thing I was thinking, Richard, both, what do you see as the main opportunities within the sort of planning system as it is, and what's the main pushbacks that you're getting? But let's do opportunities first.
100%. Again, like I mentioned, I think we're at the precipice in the field where there's a lot more planners that are being louder than before, that are bringing in all of these lived experiences into the work. So I think now, as we're seeing, concepts like CLTs and circular economies and land stewardship be part of the conversation, I do believe that there is that perfect opportunity to begin to push more radically. Again, one of the things that I've been sitting with right now as an opportunity really is, what would it look like if planners were also trained to be emergency responders? I'm just thinking about Tampa and Asheville. We have a stake in that conversation as well, right? As built environments were destroyed, we know, we have seen before that developers use that opportunity to come in and take land. And so what is the role of the planner in that moment? Do we sit back and just allow a developer to take lands and redevelop in a way we saw it with Katrina? And we're going to continue to see that, right? We know that our facilities are not up to code and we're not constructed to withstand the conditions that we're living in now. So there's an opportunity, I think, along those lines, especially now as like, leading the work and following after the work of environmental justice activists. We all need to be that now. It's no longer an exceptional thing. And I think that the work is really how do we make these exceptional frameworks into the norm practice and that we do. Some of the pushbacks, I think, are the old school planners. There are still some people who operate from a place of redlining, or I mean, let me not even go that far. Los Angeles, not too long ago, our deputy planning director got charged and indicted for bribery. So, let me be hella honest about that. So I think that again, the interest still lies in those who have the most resource and capital, whether it is developers, whether it is political feasibility, again, is also a pushback. And the fact that we continue to think under those lines, particularly in terms of planning, is frustrating. And I think another pushback also is that we haven't taken the opportunity to look at planning as a cultural shift, as a cultural strategy. Really, planning can allow us to really shape in the ways that we're approaching relationships to the built environment. We all have it. And so planning, the fact that it just lives in a too technical way, but it could also function as a cultural strategy to help shift paradigms. I'm thinking about NIMBYism. I'm thinking about the housing crisis, right? I'm thinking about transportation. We still continue to look at transportation and public transit as a nuisance, right? And who's writing it and all those things that come into play. So I think that there's an opportunity, and some of that pushback is that we're still too caught up in the technical. Again, I think that we're just at that cusp of there being a transition. Again, it's why we have so many folks who are interested in the conversation.
Right. Thanks. I've got so many more questions, but there's a load of questions coming up now. And the first one is from one of our great alums, Whitney Rearick. Hey, Whitney. I absolutely agree that we need to move away from the white male European nuclear style of urban planning. The whole concept of zoning is so removed from the way people live.
I actually have a second part that I accidentally hit return too soon. I'm sorry.
Okay. Speak to Richard.
Oh, yeah. Well, so my thought is, and by the way, this has just been fantastic. And while some of us were at UEP freaking ages ago, I just want to reassure you that we were talking about similar things, not quite as thoroughly as you are, and I'm just so thrilled. And I'm in Seattle, so we have these, and I'm doing affordable housing, so we have some of these conversations over here too. So please come up.
Mm-hmm.
But so my question is zoning seems to me like a failing idea of an academic way of looking at the city, right? It feels like a bunch of white guys were sitting in a room, modernists, right? Thinking like, how can we oversimplify this and just squish it onto people and force our ideas in a very simplistic manner? But it was largely academic, right? My concern is, and I hear you doing both. I don't hear you doing that, but I think that sometimes when you use words like decolonization, it's another academic argument. It's an important one, and I think we should be having it in circles like this. But when you go out into the real world, when you talk to, our grandmothers and our family members and people just trying to have a small business, that's not top of mind. Top of mind often is things we probably as planners don't want to admit, like they're worried about parking. I am a get rid of parking minimums person, 110%, and more transit, but we need more transit. But I worry that sometimes we replace one academic argument with a different one. And I'm not hearing you advocate that completely. In fact, I'm hearing you say, I'm using these words, and I just heard you say you're using regular words and you're talking to regular people. So I just want to say thank you for that. That's really great. And then how do we push back against people who get super lofty and academic? How do we bring them back down to the real world, make real world changes like you suggest?
And I think that's why the concept, that at least in the radical imagination work that we're doing, we're so interested in this design lab and studio, because we get to go out and test and pilot. It's not just about writing an article. It's not about publishing it. The dream right now for the radical imagination work is that we're going to do a toolkit that's co-authored by different artists and cultural strategists who are doing the work. And we're identifying now different partners that can become then the pilots to test them. But I agree with you 100%. This is why I say that, to me, the true urban planners are the señoras who are out on the streets. It's the gossip. It's the chisme. We know that there was an iteration of urban planning, being a flaneur. Like, literally your job was to just go walk around and get the gossip of the city. And I do believe in gossip. I think it's strategic information. I listen, I don't report the gossip though. You'd never report the chisme. It just teaches you comportment. But if it's institutional chisme, oh, you spill that. You spill that. I come from an organizing background that taught me to organize contra, desde, y sin el Estado, which translates to against, within, and without the state. And so I may work within the state. That's where the decolonization and the academic argument comes in. But know that my spirit will always be against it. And so when community members who are like, girl, you're not being accessible right now, it's like, okay, dope. I mean, I'm going to be very honest with you. I had a workshop this morning where I might have triggered someone, a survivor of a crash. And in that moment, I had to really step back and reassess the way I was framing that argument. Because yes, I'm talking about transit and transit equity and whatever, and I have experience. I still am unable-bodied, and I still haven't lived that in my body. Luckily, that this is where the benefit of also being a social worker comes in. I get to be trauma informed and to have that conversation and to apologize and to know when I've made the mistake and to take the L. So I agree with you. I think there is a way to definitely present academic language and to shift the discourse, because at the end of the day, also there are a lot of planners who are going to come through academia and are going to be trained in ways. And so we need to use that language to get buy-in, to push out the discourse in a way that we have to within these institutions. But the real planning happens on the street. So I like to live in Julie and I've talked about this. I was like, I'm not going to go get a PhD. I'm just going to be a practitioner. And if I get to be a professor somewhere, then I'll just be as a lecturer, and that's cute and that's fine. And, again, the multimodal approach to the work, I think it's important as well.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Whitney. Judith Robinson's got a hand up, and Judith, I see you've got a question, or is it a statement? Do you want to speak to Richard? Hi, Judith, are you still there? Okay, moving swiftly on.
Yes.
Oh,
yes. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you all. This is great work. But I am autodidactic, and so I come from the streets. But I'm a real estate broker, and we have our ears to the ground. And but we're not in the conversation very much. I'm sort of the other person in the room. But here in Philadelphia, we changed our zoning code, and we have the RCO, Registered Community Organization process, which is a fraud, okay? But I'm keeping it like you, Richard. So how can you get more people who are interested? They know me because I attend all the meetings. So can you all look at the list of the average citizen who attends the meetings, who are interested in this process, and let us in? There's a lot of talk is academia, ivory tower. I go there too, go to all the forums, all of that. But then when it comes down to where the rubber meets the roads, like they're trying to put a police facility on our historic corridor, Diamond Street. Google that, you all. Demolition by neglect, etc. We have no voice. Politics takes over. So let's talk a little bit about politics and how politics usurps all of us. Thank you.
No, 100%, Judith. And I think I agree with you. We need to be more expansive in who we're bringing into the conversation. One of the things when I taught at UCLA a couple of years ago, and I taught a class called Community Organizing for Urban Planners, But what they didn't realize was that the acronym of the class was coup. So basically, I used to say I got hired to stage a coup. And we got to read a wonderful text of violence. It's a chapter in the book Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. And the whole argument, right, is that the language of colonization is violence. So if the language of that is what we've only known, is in the language of decolonization violence as well. Again, also a very academic argument. But what's interesting about that is what I told my students was, what would it look like if we as urban planners and we as city staff went on a strike and we shut down the city because they are not doing their job, they being elected officials? Again, we as urban planners, and a lot of times as folks who work in helping operate the city, we live in what I call the place of the purgatory of power. It's a weird limbo state where we do have power because of our technical expertise, but we also don't have power because these projects have to go through some governing body. But what happens if we held them accountable through that position of power, right? If our community members cannot come to a 3 p.m. meeting because they're working, why is the urban planner stuck behind a desk and not out in the streets where people are there? You know what I mean? I always say that I'm gonna look cute. I'm gonna have business casual. I'm gonna have a cute outfit, but I'm gonna have tennis shoes on. Because if I need to go out to the streets and talk to people, then that's what we do. I think there's nothing wrong, and it should be the practice that we're really writing about 60% of our time out on the streets, not behind plans and not behind desks, but really getting to know community members and really being in conversation, because that's the richness of this field. That, I mean, I make the joke. I was like, I love community engagement work because I get paid to gossip. So, and all of a sudden you're spending time in a corridor enough, and then the señoras come out and bring you coffee and say, "Mijo, did you eat already?" There's just this beautiful relationship that we have an opportunity for, that I think, again, if we're not shifting who we're committed to, whether it is being committed to a politician, or it's committed to a city, or it's committed to the state, versus being committed to people, even that paradigm shift changes our approach.
So, Richard, when I was a kid, we had bobbies on the beat. Are you saying planners on the beat? We need planners on the beat.
We need planners on the beats, yes.
Okay, you heard it first here, folks. Crystal, you've got like 20 questions in your one posting here. Crystal, can you distill it down and ask one question to Richard?
So yeah, I mean, hey, Crystal, they, them, first semester of UEP. I've just been in the middle of trying to figure out, like, coming to the program as someone who's a community organizer and works in food insecurity and like accessibility. Like, I'm having the experience of being a member of the community for over a decade, but there not being accessibility within the community as like part of our sense of self. And I'm like, but we're here, but also Somerville is so inaccessible that the chair of the Commission for Persons with Disability could not find housing that was wheelchair accessible and had to leave the city. Like, it's dire. So how do we shift that to include like definitions of our community, people who exist but are not being prioritized in our plans for the city, I guess, is the like it is part of our community. It's just not the part that's prioritized.
100%. That's a very hard question, only because as I'm learning more about New England, I'm like, oh, New England is a hot mess. I'm like walking around cobblestone streets, and like, I get it, historic, but history for who? Again, it's all like social constructs. I'm like, take that shit off. Like, anybody need this no more? Let alone Boston. I mean, I got to live a summer in Boston, and I was like, what are these places? Oh my gosh. When there was literally, Boston was planned when there was still no right of way in the field, and because there is no right of way in Boston. So it's a hard question given that infrastructure and context, and just thinking the rate at which we need to change the infrastructure to meet those needs. One thing I really love about working in pedestrian safety, I mean, that's what my background is in Vision Zero work, the opportunity to do quick build solutions. Quick build solutions, usually either meaning temporary project with temporary materials, is always interesting, right? Just to begin to shift the paradigm a bit, you know what I mean? And because it's gonna, now I'm sounding like an incrementalist, oh Lord. But just just thinking about the rate at which the infrastructure needs to change, because some of this infrastructure, again, in Los Angeles, at least in the context of the US, it's a newer city. Los Angeles is a very old city, but it's never been part of it has been not part of the US for longer. But just New England is such an interesting place for that reason, because it has such a weird history. But to your point, I think that, again, there's that reshift of understanding. I mean, one thing I'm very inspired with, and I'm leaving with after being in Maine, the group did an amazing job at bringing in folks with diverse abilities, and in so many ways, and so many different able-bodied people, and understanding and hearing those stories in real time, and then becoming that problem solver and that thinker of like, how do I really create a place where everyone belongs? What are the ways in which, like, someone who has the ability to see versus someone who doesn't, how are they talking to one another? And is there an interdependence as opposed to codependence, right? And so there's some framing and some reshifting, again, of the way that we also perceive people with different abled bodies and accessibility as a whole. One thing that right now Los Angeles is doing, just as an example, the Olympics are coming to Los Angeles in 2028. The way that Los Angeles pitched the bid was that they didn't have to construct anything new because all of the facilities are there. They're just making it more regional to connect. And so that kind of gave space for other types of projects to come through. But we also know that the Paralympics are coming alongside with the Olympics. And so what that became is, I know of a lot of folks who are advocating in LA to really reassess ADA compliance across the entire city. Because if you're saving money over here, well, boo, let me tell you, y'all, some of these ramps, I mean, some intersections don't even have ramps. And then some of your, pedestrian ramps are so bad. And so that became an opportunity. So I say that to say it really poking maybe in some places how we can bring that into the conversation. I go back to what I mentioned earlier. We're just so caught up in the silo of what this field or what this scope of work looks like. And I think what's important to understand, it's like the scope of work should always be flexible because we know it's going to constantly shift on the ground. That was a very long-winded and maybe vague answer for a very hard question.
Thanks, Crystal. We have a question from AB who says, in what ways could we empower communities to do planning? How do you see fugitive planning in practice?
I don't know if I understand what fugitive planning is, but it sounds fun.
It does sound fun, doesn't it? AB, can you give us a one sentence what fugitive planning is?
Yeah, sure. And I think my name is Asha, by the way. I think you've been speaking to this quite a bit, but it's taking this sort of information and practice that we have and disseminating that to the community so that they become planners themselves. And so I think, just, I guess, some background, like I was born and raised in Chicago. I grew up on the South Side. Like I became a planner because I noticed the sort of ways in which the city was super segregated and like experiencing that violence firsthand that occurs spatially. And so as I've moved more into the practice of planning, I've kind of, okay, excuse my language, but like I've just seen like how we're so wrapped up in like the kind of bullshit of it all, but we're not actually implementing anything. And so while people continue to suffer in these spaces, how do we sort of, I guess, like move towards putting ourselves out of business, so to speak, and like empowering the community to implement solutions themselves?
Yeah, I think, okay, now I like fugitive planning. Okay, I see. Okay, it's more like this anarchist planning. I love it. I think a lot of things need to shift within the field as well. For example, some practical things. This is very much a long-term strategy for sure. But some practical things that I think come to mind are really reframing engagement as a phase. Engagement is not a phase. Engagement is constantly happening. You're in community and in relationship with people all the time, and you're not in engagement just to collect data. One of the things that we do at the Institute, we have a toolkit, and I'd be more than happy to share this resource later, on transformative research. We use participatory action research, and this is a process where we work with community members to not be the subjects of the research, but rather to be the research designers, the data collectors, the data analysts, and it becomes a whole research process. And the way that we're interested in the way we frame research at the Institute is really research is just generating knowledge. And we know that our communities have generated knowledge in many different ways, or through oral histories, in some practices, and in some of the diaspora through braiding, through song and dance, right? There's knowledge being generated all the time. And I think reframing even the way that we do engagement as a way of collecting knowledge is very important. Working hand in hand with your organizers. I think if you're in planning, and again, I come from an organizing background, little story that I'm gonna share right quickly. When I was at the Department of Transportation and LADOT in LA, oh, they're gonna come for me, Julian. See, I'm telling you all the secrets. But I was friends with the administrative assistants because they knew the calendars. And in our city, LADOT is across the street from City Hall. So when our general manager had a meeting across the street, girl, I'd hit up all the organizers. Go get her. She's crossing the street now. She has a meeting at 10. It's 9:50. Go get her, right? There's always an opportunity to work in conversation with agitators, not with the politician. Again, that's who I steer from. Though there is a conspiracy in LA for me to run for city council, and it's a conspiracy that I started. But could you imagine me, Julian, talking about F this and F that in City Hall?
I'll work on your campaign. Richard, let me know, buddy.
I have a couple of months to think about it, but we may run for city council. And again, but the goal is to agitate. There is nothing wrong with agitation. So I think from the position of planning, I think being able to work alongside your organizers who are on the ground and doing the membership work and the capacity building, if you work alongside them to move the needle in that way, I think that's also important. And girl, put politicians' business out there. They have a voting record. Put it out there. Let people know what they're up to. Because when you work in planning, you know who the commissioner is, who is an asshole. You know what the city council member is going to decide. We know a lot of things in the way the city operates. And if we're able to share that public information, because FOIA, and then you don't want to get in trouble. But if you want to share public information and help create strategy for organizers, I think that's a way to really be more of a fugitive within planning.
We have a question from Kate O'Brien. Hi, Kate. Kate's another one of our brilliant alumnus. Kate, what's your question?
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Richard, it's such a breath of fresh air to hear what you're saying about our field of work. And it was more sort of a affirming comment, I think, to really invite and encourage and push my fellow colleagues in this field to get radical in the work, in the occasions and the moments we have, whether it's with our teams, whether it's in a community meeting, to ask questions that are heart-centered, that encourage people to speak, turn toward your neighbor, look at one another, have a conversation about a memory, get people with stories. I think about bridging work, and really the wave of the future is, if we're going to be able to imagine, we have to remember where we came from, our past experiences, those moments as young people we were the most vulnerable, the scary places that we are socialized to not go. I just think we really need to ruffle up how we do our work and how we think about it. It's like take the seriousness away for a little bit and just like, let's get real, let's get humble. And that really informs my work. And so I just feel a lot of kinship with what you're talking about here, and likely a lot of other people on this call.
Yeah, the one thing I'll share about the word radical, the reason why we use the word radical in radical imagination, but also in reimagining urban planning and be more radical, twofold. One, yes, the scary definition of radical, the scary connotation, I should say, that the word radical has is appropriate because we need to be more radical. One. And two, the etymology of the word radical is root. It's to go back. It's to remember what is the root cause, what is the essence of relationship to land and bodies, right? I say that to me, urban planning is not about materials. It's about restoring the sacred relationship we have between body and earth. And now more than ever do we need it. So just wanted to add a little bit of why we use the word radical.
Thanks, Kate. Okay, so I get to ask you the last question, Richard, and I'm just wondering, I haven't heard the R word, reparation, reparative. Everything you're talking about lends itself to joining the push to shift from racial planning to reparative planning? How does your thinking add to the push for reparation through urban?
100%. That's a hard question. I only say that that's a hard question from a place of my own racialized identity, right? And who I am as a non-Black person of color, living in Mexico City and trying to figure out, because I'm like, so does Spain give us reparations for 1521? Like, I'm trying to figure out that conversation. I'm like, does the US owe me reparations from 1985? And of course, I totally agree with reparations in the context in which of atoning for, right? In atonement. I think it's important to understand in that framing. I think what I could add to the conversation is that it's possible. That atonement does not, and reparations doesn't have to live, I think, in the way that it has been marketed. I don't know, marketed is the right word, framed, and what it means, right? As a really radical, extreme way that it's like, but the harms of enslavement really in the US we see them everywhere. It's in the way that this country's economic system was created, racial systems, I mean, everything. So atonement, I think, is possible at many scales and many levels, and should be what we should be working towards, right? Atonement with resiliency more than anything, because we can't recreate these systems. It's the conversation that we have all the time at that I have at the Institute all the time. Like, I'm down for belonging, but don't make this shit all kumbaya. Because I can't. No, conflict exists in the natural world. The natural world is how we look at conflict as something generative as opposed to something destructive that can shift the work in the way that we do the work. So I think that when it comes to reparations, what this series, and it doesn't explicitly say it, but it should, is in a complete agreement with it. And we have to we owe reparations to many folks and to many societies and to many ecologies. And I think now more than ever, I wrote something quite weird the other day that kind of sat with me, but I saw no politics involved, but I saw Beyonce's speech at the Harris rally, and it was just that was a dystopic moment to see someone of that celebrity statue being there. And I wrote something along the lines of, somebody prophesized about this moment, and either a prophecy will be fulfilled or an apocalypse is about to begin. And I say those big, heavy words because, again, we are at such an interesting time and at a shifting point. It feels like the chrysalis is about to be born or is about to be birthed, but it's tangible. The change is so tangible. And I mean, I've been reading your work, Julian, since I've been in grad school. And the things that we're saying are not new. You've been saying this for years alongside other colleagues. And I don't know. I mean, I have a question to you. Do you feel that we are at some sort of turning point in time in the way that we're having these conversations about reimagining and radicalizing planning?
Oh, I think, yeah. And you mentioned my great hero, Leonie Sandercock, and I was very privileged 2 summers ago to go and go to Vancouver. She had a group of people and we talked about her latest book, which was published in one of my book series. And, she is the architect of therapeutic planning. And you mentioned that, and, social worker, therapeutic planning. Therapeutic planning is about reparation. It's not about cutting checks, but it's about a reparative approach in our thinking, such that planning becomes a therapeutic process. And so yeah, absolutely. But I think the calls are getting louder. I've actually got a student, and I don't know whether Lauren Chapman is in the room there, but we're looking at planning authorities and what moves they are making towards a more reparative approach. Now, the dream is, what would a reparative comprehensive plan look like? What are the implications for transportation, open space, housing, employment policy, etc.? At the moment, we're finding examples like housing policy in Evanston, Illinois, or some of the experiments, restoration of the land in Huntington Beach to the African American family in California. So we're getting little examples, little experiments in reparation. But when do we get the paradigm shift? That's what I want to map. When is the first authority going to come up with a comprehensive plan whose paradigm is reparative? And this isn't just me or you calling for this. Mayors organized for racial equity want this. Planning directors want this. Rashad Williams, a brilliant young assistant professor who wrote a classic paper, who's now at University of Pittsburgh, and I'm going to watch his work. He has pushed this further. So it's on the way. How do we speed it up?
Yeah, because I feel like there's an urgency that we haven't experienced before. I mean, even in my lifetime, I feel like the urgency has just gotten louder, and more dire, to be honest. And I agree with you, and I'm hoping that reimagining urban planning in the way, again, we did not imagine for there to be this response, and now to sit with that, right? Because clearly there's folks who are asking for that paradigm shift. And I mean, I'm an organizer, so I'm a true believer that if we come in numbers, we can move mountains for sure. So hopefully this continues to become a movement in a way that, that I can hold it, that other people can hold it, and that we test ideas, because I think a lot of it, what's so hard, it's that, and like Whitney, alluded to this, is that these ideas are living in our head, in our conversations, in our circles, but how are they being tested? How are they being pushed? And how are they being, refined? And we're not going to get this shit right. It's deconstructing centuries of traumas. So we know we're never going to get it right. I mean, that's where the therapy happens, though.
That's right. Well, Jose Richard Aviles, Othering and Belonging Institute, I could go on all afternoon.
Yeah.
Take some time. We need to catch up. It's been 6 years. Can we give a warm Cities at Tufts thank you to Jose Richard Aviles? Next week, not next week, we have a colloquium on November 13th, and it's Jeanette Wessel from Roger Williams University talking about mobilizing food vending. See you soon. Again, thank you, Richard.